The microeconomics of ARC Resources Ltd.
For our agenda, we will be talking about supply and demand, an introduction and an elaboration, elasticity of firms' productions, decisions, and costs in the short run, costs in the long run, perfect competition, monopoly, and imperfect competition, followed by recommendations, the conclusion, and references.
So what is price elasticity of demand? It is a measure of how much the quantity demanded of a product changes as a result of a change in its price. We use the elasticity coefficient, the percent change in quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price, to measure this. When the coefficient is greater than 1, demand is elastic. Consumers are very responsive to price. When it is less than 1, demand is inelastic. And when it equals 1, it is unitary elastic. For ARC resources, this is directly relevant. In the short run, demand for natural gas is largely inelastic. Home heating and industrial use have very few immediate alternatives, so when ARC raises prices, quantity demanded does not fall much. This gives ARC real pricing power in its domestic contracts. The three determinants of elasticity are the number of substitutes available, the proportion of income spent on the product, and the time period. In the long run, as renewables grow, demand for gas becomes more elastic, which is exactly why ARC Resources invests in innovation today. Elasticity and total revenue. Elasticity has a direct impact on ARC's revenue strategy. When demand is inelastic and prices rise, total revenue increases. This is the short-run reality for ARC's pipeline and domestic supply contracts. ARC can raise prices and grow revenue because consumers have limited alternatives. However, in ARC's LNG export markets, demand is more elastic because international buyers have more choices. If ARC raises prices too aggressively in those markets, it risks losing customers to competitors and total revenue actually falls. So, in elastic markets, ARC must focus on competitive pricing to capture volume. This makes ARC a strong real-world example of how elasticity shapes strategy, applying different pricing approaches across inelastic domestic markets and elastic export markets. Other elasticity measures. Beyond price elasticity of demand, there are three more types ARC must consider. First, elasticity of supply. In the market period, ARC supply is perfectly inelastic. Existing wells and pipelines set a hard ceiling on output. In the short run, it stays inelastic as new projects take years to complete. But in the long run, supply becomes elastic as ARC invests in new drilling and infrastructure. Second, income elasticity. Natural gas and oil are normal goods. Demand rises as income grows. Basic household energy is a normal necessity with a coefficient between 0 and 1, while premium energy services behave closer to a luxury good. Rising Canadian incomes support long-term demand for ARC's products. Third, cross-elasticity. Natural gas and renewables are substitutes. When renewable prices rise, gas demand rises. That is a positive cross-elasticity that benefits ARC. But natural gas and gas turbines are complements. When turbine costs rise, gas demands can fall. ARC must track both relationships. In summary, elasticity is not just a textbook concept for ARC resources. It drives every pricing, production, and investment decision the company makes. Thank you.
ARC Resource is an excellent real world example of supply and demand because the company's operations clearly demonstrate demand, supply, and market equilibrium in action. Demand for ARC's natural gas, condensate, natural gas liquids, and crude oil all shift based on price as well as substitutes, complements, real income, and income substitutions, effects which illustrates why demand curves slope downward. Meanwhile, movement along ARC's demand curve are only made by changing the price of that product, while shifts in that curve are caused by non-price determinants like weather, economic growth, exports demand, and industrial production. From a supply standpoint, ARC recognizes how firms like itself are willing to supply more at higher prices, upward sloping curve, but it also experiences increasing costs as it produces more output due to diminishing returns. The company also demonstrates the difference between a change in quantity supplied, a shift along the curve due to change in price, versus a change in supply, shift of the curve due to the things like technology, infrastructure, production costs, quality of reserves, and access to transportation. All over, ARC Resources proves that market demand and market supply will always interact to reach an equilibrium price and quantity. When marketing conditions change, ARC's production, revenue, and strategies change as well. ARC Resources is certainly imperfect when applying concepts from Chapter 10 because it is not a pure monopoly. For example, ARC does not satisfy the definition of monopoly as it is the only seller in Canada's energy market. However, ARC still works well with Chapter 10. First, the definition of monopoly is still useful when thinking about how ARC dominates in terms of size, has a low cost structure, giving it flexibility with prices, and controls much of the larger pipeline infrastructure. Students should be able to look at ARC and think about how a firm with that much market share can earn some market power in an imperfectly competitive industry. Secondly, the concepts of barriers to entry apply to ARC since it is difficult to enter the energy production business. Technical knowledge and skill, lots of capital, infrastructure, and government approvals are just some of the challenges new competitors will face when entering Alberta's energy industry. Third, the relationship between demand and marginal revenue is still applicable if a company with enough market power to care about how its prices affect output revenue. Lastly, the chapter's discussion of profit maximization and how firms should focus on output, costs, and revenues like ARC's focus on efficient operations and low cost production.
Supply and Demand and Elaboration. Chapter 3. A price floor is a government regulation stipulating the minimum price that can be charged for a product. This terminology doesn't really apply for our company, ARC Resources, because of the nature of this company. Oil and gas companies don't typically get a price floor unless long-term contracts guarantee minimum prices. A price ceiling is a government regulation stipulating the maximum price that can be charged for a product. There is no price ceiling for oil and gas. Rather, price fluctuates freely depending on global supply and demand, transportation constraints, and refining ability. Taxes. Tax is a major factor for ARC Resources because they pay a lot. They pay corporate income tax, which is money they pay to the federal and provincial governments based on their profits. Their biggest cost, however, comes from royalties. Royalty is not traditional taxes, but they act very similarly. So basically, governments take money based on the value of the oil and gas produced. This is because the government owns the land, so ARC is basically paying for the right to extract resources. Since most of the ARC resource operations are done in Crown land, they end up paying a lot. Crown land is a land owned by the federal, provincial governments instead of private corporations. Production quotas. There are no current production quotas imposed on ARC resources, but the government has occasionally done so for energy companies. They usually put up quotas to control oversupply. This is called a curtailment policy. If this was imposed, ARC would have to reduce output, manage storage, or delay production.
A firm's production decisions and costs in the short run. What type of firm is ARC Resources? ARC Resources is a corporation, which means that the company is run by a board of directors. The owners are not personally responsible for their debts and are not directly involved in the firm's operations. Production is the activity of a business or firm using inputs to obtain an output of some product. The resource they sell or their output is natural gas liquids, condensate, and crude oil. Essentially, they sell unconventional natural gas products. The question is, what are their inputs? Their inputs would be factors such as the cost of raw materials equipment maintenance, employment labor costs, and the cost of operational strategies. Explicit costs are physical costs such as labor, utilities, material, and supplies. Some explicit costs are operating expenses, transportation costs, royalty fees, G&A expenses, interest and financing expenses, income tax expenses, and expenses surrounding depletion, amortization, impairment of property, plant, and equipment. Here we have explicit costs summarized. As you see, we have everything down from operating expenses down to property, plant, and equipment. You can find all of this information on our Resources 2025 annual report that was released on February of 2026. And yeah, on page 80. So look for the 2025 annual report if you wanna find out more information about this. Implicit costs. Implicit costs are more like opportunity costs that come from the use of resources but are not paid out in physical money. A good example of this would be labor that is put in by owners. Two examples of implicit costs are the higher water handling disposal costs at the Kakwa facility and the Kakwa acquisition integration, along with higher costs from new infrastructure that have led to increased operating expenses. Essentially, in the pursuit of new opportunities, the implicit costs would be incurring higher operating expenses. It is difficult to calculate implicit costs as the implicit costs are more like opportunity costs. Total product produced by ARC Resources. In 2025, it was reported that the average daily production for barrels of oil equivalent was 374,336 barrels of oil per day, which works out to around 136.633 million barrels of oil equivalent per year. Are they a perfect or imperfect competition? ARC Resources is a differentiated oligopoly, which means that they have few sellers, their product type is differentiated, and they have substantial control over their own market. This is because ARC Resources Ltd is the largest pure-play Montney producer, as they own over 1.1 million acres of Montney land and they have a deep inventory with high rates of return. They have also lowered the risk of core development opportunities with significant geographical diversity. This means that their market is an imperfect competition as they have great control over their market but not to the degree of operating in a perfect competition.
Cost in the long run. How does ARC Resources Ltd make decisions on cost and production and finding the right size and efficiency? How does ARC Resources Limited make decisions on cost and production? ARC Resources Limited makes its cost and production decisions by focusing on long-run planning where all inputs such as labor, capital, and technology can be adjusted to improve efficiency. The company uses long-run average cost (LRAC) to determine the most efficient level of output by producing a large amount over 350,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day. ARC Resources benefit from economies of scale, meaning the cost per unit decreases as production increases. This allows the company to spread fixed costs like infrastructure, drilling equipment, and transportation across a higher level of output, helping guide decisions about investment in operations and technology. The right size and efficiency. At the same time, ARC Resources must be careful not to expand too much as this can lead to diseconomies of scale, where costs increase due to inefficiency such as management and communication issues. To avoid this, the company aims to operate at its minimum efficient scale, MES, where average costs are at the lowest. ARC Resources maintains stronger efficiency with operating costs around $6 to $8 per barrel and continues to improve performance by using automation, and data analytics. Overall, the company balances growth with efficiency by adapting to changes in input prices and market conditions, while keeping costs low and production effective.
Our recommendations for ARC Resources Ltd. ARC Resources is a pretty successful and growing company as is. The only recommendation that we have is that they keep strategically expanding to stay on top of certain markets. In conclusion, ARC Resources is a corporation operating in a differential oligopoly market. They control vast plots of land in their operations. Although they are successful in expanding, they must be careful not to expand too much, as it could lead to diseconomies of scale. They should also continue monitoring their explicit and implicit costs while searching for new opportunities for corporate expansion. Here is a list of our references. As you see, ARC Resources' home website and attached reports contain most of the information that was required. We pulled out definitions of certain microeconomics topics from the 11th edition of Principles of Microeconomics by Sayre and other authors. The publisher of this was McGraw-Hill. Do you have any questions?